Most people assume the agricultural legacy of World War II is simple industrial expansion, chemical fertilizers, mechanized farming, and the early groundwork of what would become the Green Revolution. But that narrative leaves out something quieter and, in practical terms, far more efficient for small-scale food security. During the war, governments and civilians rediscovered a soil method that consistently produced 2 to 3 times the yield of conventional garden plots. Without synthetic fertilizer, without large machinery, and often in damaged or depleted ground. It worked so well that it helped urban populations endure severe supply disruptions. And yet, within a generation, this knowledge was largely pushed aside, institutional memory faded, and commercial agriculture moved decisively in the opposite direction. If you value serious historical analysis that reveals what war actually teaches about survival, subscribe to the Survival Record and stay with this one carefully, because this is not just about gardening. It is about how systems choose which knowledge survives peace and which knowledge quietly disappears. The technique did not begin in the war, but the war forced it into the open. The method widely promoted during World War II was not new. Variations existed in European market gardening traditions going back centuries, particularly in densely populated regions where land was scarce and soil had to produce at extraordinary intensity. What changed in the 1940s was scale, urgency, and documentation. When shipping lanes were threatened, farmland was bombed, and labor was diverted into military service. Governments faced a simple constraint. More food had to come from less space, often with fewer inputs. Britain's Dig for Victory campaign is the most widely remembered example, but similar emergency cultivation programs appeared across Europe and parts of Asia. What these programs emphasized, often quietly in technical pamphlets rather than public slogans, was deep soil preparation for permanent raised beds. Not shallow tilling, not wide row spacing. Instead, intensive vertical cultivation. The key principle was simple. Most conventional cultivation disturbs only the top layer of soil, compressing the layers beneath it over time. Plant roots are forced to spread laterally rather than deeply. Water drains inefficiently, nutrients stratify unevenly, and yields plateau. Wartime agronomists and experienced market gardeners knew that if the soil was opened deeply, often to 50 or 60 centimeters, and structured with organic matter throughout the profile, the biological and physical behavior of the ground changed fundamentally. Roots penetrated farther, moisture retention improved dramatically, soil aeration increased, microbial activity expanded through a larger volume of earth. And once established, these beds remained productive for years with minimal disturbance. This was not just theoretical. Governments documented yield increases that were difficult to ignore. Wartime agricultural bulletins, particularly those circulated in Britain and parts of continental Europe, recorded consistent yield gains from deep-dug permanent beds compared to standard row systems. These were not minor improvements. Reports regularly described production increases of 2-fold and sometimes 3-fold per unit area, especially for root crops, leafy greens, and dense vegetable plantings. The mechanism was not mysterious. Deep soil preparation allowed far closer spacing of plants because competition for nutrients and moisture occurred in 3 dimensions rather than 2. The soil effectively became a living reservoir rather than a thin productive layer resting atop compacted ground. Equally important was resilience. Deep, structured soil buffered against irregular rainfall and supported plant recovery after stress. In wartime conditions, when irrigation infrastructure could be damaged or unreliable, this mattered enormously. Urban cultivation programs, including those in bomb-affected areas, often relied on rebuilding soil from rubble-filled or compacted land. Raised bed systems made that possible. Instead of attempting to farm across an entire damaged surface, growers concentrated labor into defined beds, and transformed soil quality where it counted. Labor-intensive? Yes, but wartime economies frequently had civilian labor available, especially among populations excluded from combat service. And once established, these beds required less ongoing intervention than repeatedly tilled ground. From a survival standpoint, the efficiency was extraordinary. The soil itself became infrastructure rather than just a growing medium. One of the most important conceptual shifts during this period was how soil was understood. In industrial agriculture, soil often functions as a substrate into which nutrients are delivered. In the wartime intensive model, soil itself was the primary system. Deep preparation created structured layers rich in organic matter that behaved almost like engineered biological infrastructure. Air, water, and microbial life circulated through a stable matrix. Instead of feeding plants directly, growers cultivated the conditions that allowed soil to regulate fertility internally. This approach reduced dependence on external inputs at precisely the historical moment when external inputs were hardest to obtain. It also revealed something strategically significant. Productivity did not require expansion of farmland if soil volume and function were expanded downward. For nations facing blockade or land loss, that insight had clear implications. After the war, agricultural policy moved in the opposite direction. When peace returned, the pressures that had made labor-intensive soil building necessary began to disappear, at least in industrialized countries. Mechanization expanded rapidly. Chemical nitrogen production, scaled up for wartime explosives manufacturing, was redirected into fertilizer markets. Governments prioritized output per worker rather than output per square meter. Deep, hand-prepared beds did not align with this new framework. They required careful management, permanent layouts, and attention to soil biology rather than machine efficiency. Row cropping, compatible with tractors and synthetic inputs, scaled more easily across large farms. Agricultural education shifted accordingly. Extension programs emphasized chemical fertility, mechanized tillage, and standardized spacing systems designed for equipment, not root architecture. The wartime soil methods were not formally banned or discredited. They were simply not taught. Over time, knowledge that is not transmitted becomes invisible. Techniques once documented in emergency manuals faded into niche horticultural traditions, preserved mainly by small-scale growers and later by ecological agriculture movements that rediscovered similar principles independently. Commercial incentives reinforce the shift. Systems dependent on purchased inputs generate ongoing markets. Systems designed to build self-sustaining soil do not. This was not a coordinated erasure in the conspiratorial sense. It was structural neglect driven by economic alignment, but the effect was similar. Survival logic and industrial logic diverged sharply. From a survivalist perspective, the wartime deep bed system solved a specific problem: maximum food production from limited, potentially degraded land with minimal external supply chains. From an industrial perspective, the priority was different: maximize total output across large areas with minimal labor, supported by centralized production of inputs. Both are rational within their own frameworks, but they produce different kinds of resilience. Industrial agriculture excels at scale under stable conditions. Intensive soil systems excel under disruption, scarcity, and localized self-reliance. World War II forced governments to confront disruption. Post-war prosperity allowed them to optimize for stability instead. The knowledge did not vanish entirely, but it no longer shaped mainstream agricultural design. Later, ecological farming movements quietly rediscovered the same principles. Decades after the war, various agricultural innovators began documenting remarkably similar outcomes when they experimented with deep soil preparation, permanent raised beds, and dense planting. Many of them believed they were developing new methods. In reality, they were rediscovering wartime practice and, in some cases, much older market gardening traditions. This pattern is common in technological history. Knowledge that falls out of institutional circulation often re-emerges when conditions once again make it useful. What changed was context. Instead of wartime necessity, the rediscovery was driven by concerns about soil degradation, input costs, and long-term sustainability. The biological mechanisms, however, remained exactly what wartime agronomists had observed. Deeper soil structure multiplies functional root space, stabilizes moisture dynamics, and increases productivity per unit area. The war had simply demonstrated this under extreme pressure. The deeper lesson is about what societies choose to remember. World War II is often remembered through battles, leaders, and geopolitical transformation. Yet survival at the civilian level depended just as much on soil management decisions made in ordinary spaces, backyards, public parks, improvised plots carved from damaged land. The raised bed systems that helped sustain populations were not glamorous. They did not win battles, but they reveal something fundamental about resilience. When supply chains fail, biological systems that regenerate themselves become strategic assets. Post-war agricultural policy did not reject this knowledge because it failed. It moved past it because different priorities prevailed. But history does not erase effectiveness. It only changes visibility. Remembering overlooked knowledge is itself a form of preparedness. The value of studying wartime soil practices is not nostalgia. It is recognition that under constraint, certain methods repeatedly prove their worth. Deep structured soil, permanent beds, dense planting, and biological fertility management are not emergency improvisations. They are tested responses to systemic stress. World War II forced societies to rely on them. Peace allowed them to be forgotten. Understanding that cycle matters, especially for anyone interested in preparedness, food security, or the long-term consequences of how knowledge is transmitted or neglected. The history of survival is not only about crisis. It is about what remains available when crisis returns. If you value serious historical analysis that looks beyond familiar narratives and examines what actually sustains human communities under pressure, subscribe to the Survival Record and share this video with others who care about the deeper lessons history leaves behind.